Hello and welcome to Clearing the Lanes with me, Melissa Sitole, a podcast to equip and help you in your ultimate calling, which is to glorify God. I'm a newlywed, a mom, a Bible-believing Christian, and a woman in corporate, and I'm so excited to be talking to you today. All right, you would probably all know by now about the war between Russia and Ukraine, and heard about the pressure which was placed on South Africa to arrest Putin should he set foot on South African soil. What you may not know is how we ended up here, what the history is, how this impacts you, and why all this matters to us as a nation and to us as Christians. Today we're having a fascinating conversation with Lukhona Mnguni to give us some insight on this topic. Lukhona is the host of the eNCA show On the Spot with Lukhona Mnguni, which is every Sunday at noon until 1 p.m. He is a researcher, a political analyst, and broadcaster, and is really one of the best minds in the country, which is why I can't wait for you to hear all we spoke about. I do want to apologize for the sound change in the second half, but really, this is not a part of the interview to be missed at all, so do keep listening. All right, stay tuned. Hello, Lukhona. Welcome to Clearing the Lens. Long time no see. Thank you so much for making time to join us today.
No, I don't know what time. It's good afternoon, it's good morning somewhere else in the world. So, but really, really good to see you, Melissa, after quite some time.
Awesome. I'm going to jump right in so we can talk about as much as we can today, and just take us through the history and where we find ourselves today with regards to the Russia, Ukraine, the SA, the West war, and dialogues and situations that have happened over the last few years, actually. So in terms of the history, we all know in February 2022, there was a war that Russia launched against Ukraine. And that's been described as the largest ground-based war since World War II. But ultimately, this event was a culmination of years of tension between Ukraine and Russia, where in 2014, Russia had annexed Crimea, which was ultimately internationally recognized as Ukrainian territory that's occupied by Russia. But essentially, going even further back, when the Soviet Union dissolved, Russia claims that an agreement was made with NATO that they wouldn't expand eastwards. NATO denies this, but essentially they have expanded eastwards. And now there were talks with Ukraine possibly joining NATO. And Russia essentially felt that, from my understanding, that they were threatened by this relationship, with Ukraine being politically, geographically, and just economically important to Russia as well. And so this is how we ended up with February 2022 occurring. There has been, of course, condemnation from the international community by this. The EU intensified their sanctions that they've had against Russia since 2014 already. You've got the UN, which tried to post numerous resolutions to try and get Russia to remove their forces from Ukraine. A handful of countries voted with Russia, with 35 abstaining. All the BRICS nations abstained. I think Brazil initially didn't abstain, and then they voted against Russia, but eventually they also abstained. But this was tricky because Russia has one of the 5 seats on the Security Council of the UN, and so they have a veto vote. Essentially, our position as SA with this has been that we think that dialogue, actually, let me read what we say. We say we want to encourage mediation and dialogue and adopt constructive outcomes leading to that end. You've got China saying dialogue and negotiation are the only viable way out to resolve the Ukraine crisis. So essentially, you've got us singing from the same hymn book regarding this. But as we know, regardless of international condemnation regarding Russia's actions, that hasn't deterred them. They, I think it was at the first year mark, there were over 100,000 Ukrainians reported as killed or wounded. And at the 1 year mark as well, there are about 8 million refugees that had fled Ukraine. Russian losses are expected to be even higher than that. But essentially, no one really wants to engage Russia in open warfare. They've got the highest stash of nuclear warheads because Russia inherited all the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons. And then closer to home lately, we've got SA, which was accused by the US of providing weapons to Russia. Apparently, there was a ship that docked, and so that's putting us at threat of losing out on AGOA. Washington doesn't think that we should host the AGOA forum because now we're at risk of being expelled from AGOA or not being a beneficiary of AGOA anymore. You've also got recently this week, I heard of sanctions against a Malian defense minister and two Malian officials because of actions that they've performed that have benefited the Wagner Group's efforts in Ukraine. And just last week, the UK sanctioned 13 individuals with links to the Wagner Group in Mali and Sudan. So all this is really not something that's happening outside of the African continent as well. There are also some stories that are happening quite close to home. Would you say that I've summarized that a very complex situation adequately? What more do you think our audience needs to know about this?
That's a very comprehensive summary, in actual fact, about the history of the what many would call the post-Soviet Union era. The world generally has been fundamentally shifting since World War II, where there was an understanding of ways in which to broker power, and there was an establishment of really 5 geographically strong regions in the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, who am I leaving out? France. And these entities formed themselves into, there was the United Nations Security Council that was established later on within the ambits of the United Nations. Of course, the United Nations itself is a later entity that is demonstrating to a degree the changing world, because there would have been the League of Nations before it, but as more countries got more power in senses of independence, colonial rule was under threat, and you were having African countries gaining independence, Latin American countries gaining independence, and so on. But the post-World War II world it really is the one that continues to define the power arrangements within the global architecture, particularly the global security architecture, because where this problem comes from is about how do you create detente in the sense that countries feel that they hold enough power balances that makes them equally secured. But as things would happen, the world continued to change post-World War II. The collapse of the Berlin Wall was extremely important for the unification of Germany, which then began a process where effectively the dissolution of the Soviet Union as we know it. So all the countries that used to belong to, some countries that belong to the Soviet Union claimed their independence. Your Ukraines are one of those countries. And what had then happened over time, because that was also the end of another global era, which was the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. Now, because the Soviet Union was such a powerful entity that continued to be a threat in many ways to the US and other Western countries. The Soviet Union's relationship with Cuba, for example, that showcases it could assist Cuba if there would be a need for Cuba to be given weaponry, missiles, and all of this. That history is important in understanding the evolution of the power arrangements. So you then had the North Atlantic Treaty Organization being formed, which is now simply just known as NATO. And NATO was formed to then be a security bloc for the West, anchored by the US. And that's because post-World War II, much of Western Europe was in ruins, and only the US was untouched by that war. So the US became leveraged on that, and so that it could have power over the Western parts of Europe without necessarily colonizing them, but probably monetarily colonizing them, because then the IMF, International Monetary Fund, is founded, the World Bank is founded, and the World Bank at first was founded as the Reconstruction Development Bank, because it was meant to reconstruct Europe, but funded by the US and leverages. Of course, then as other countries got independence, they needed to be considered into those institutions, and therefore you got this sense of a United Nations, a World Bank, and so on. But as things happened, there are always things that are meant to have a short lifespan. So NATO was meant to be a short lifespan. Some argue that NATO shouldn't have existed post the Soviet Union era, because all countries now, Germany was unifying. In actual fact, I would argue that Germany, for example, is a far stronger economy, country in stature, and anchor of the European Union than France is, but Germany is not a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, and France is. So we are actually in an era where we are operating with yesteryear power arrangements in an era of reoriented or evolved power arrangements. And so it creates this schizophrenia in terms of how the global arena is governed. Yes, you're quite correct. There was an understanding that if the US felt threatened by the Soviet Union, Russia would feel as equally threatened by the expansion of NATO, which is effectively a proxy of the US in many ways, if it came towards Russia, because the Russians never believed that the relationships between the US and Russia would ever stop being antagonistic. But again, that agreement for me carries a simple logic that is illogical, in the sense that if we then accept that the countries that used to belong to the Soviet Union are now sovereign countries who have to make their own calculations for their sovereignty, for their security, for their protection, you can't disbar them from joining any organization that they truly believe is in the best service of their national interest. Yeah, sure, there are consequences to actions, but you can't strip a country of its sovereignty once it has gained it. And therefore, your consequence management of its actions has still to be within the bounds of sovereignty. And therefore, if you invade it as Russia did Ukraine, effectively, Ukraine has no choice but to defend itself. And that's why when Zelensky was being given an easy route out by Western counterparts to say, well, we can just send you a private jet flyer, he says, I can't, because I'm a president of this country. So it's, for me, though, the whole thing is not just Russia invading Ukraine. There are a number of proxy wars that are there. One of them is quite clear that the US still has an interest to see a Russia of diminished stature, of diminished standing. And I think Vladimir Putin, over the years, his calculation was that he cannot trust that Russia would be secured and would be able to play the geopolitical game without him at the helm. And this is why he has done all the sort of consolidations of power that he has done in Russia, extended his stay in power, and so on. And you could argue that he is probably correct, and that there are countries that without that big leader or brother leader, as it would be, for example, in Libya, it's quite clear that Libya post Muammar Gaddafi is just chaotic. Whether you agreed or disagreed with his hegemony as a dictator, the post-Gaddafi world has not yielded any prospects for Libya. And therefore, maybe Putin has those fears. Are they rational fears? Some try and put them at, he's paranoid, it's his personality. So that history is that history. But there are far bigger proxy wars. China is part of those proxy wars. The moves on Russia are, in fact, to a degree, a signal to China, but also to see how China responds in support of Russia. And China has been quite circumspect because it knows that it has its own outstanding business with the US that can come anytime. And that can come in many forms, and not just in terms of military war, because the two countries are so geographically apart, unlike Russia and Ukraine. But the huge trade disputes between China and the US that started particularly under Donald Trump, huge technology warfare that's happening between the two entities, with the US removing China from Android and so on. So we live in a very complicated and complex world that I think is beginning to be very difficult to comprehend, but with vast consequences of many of the actions that are taken.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, look, depending on the sources that you look at, you could either come away with a very full and unbiased and complete picture, or you could come away thinking that Putin is just on some power trip and he just wants Russia to be, the biggest superpower in the Eurasia region, and that's why this is happening. So it's so important for us to find multiple sources, right? To really understand the density of the history that's brought us here today. Moving on to the trade and the threat of being kicked out of AGOA that I spoke to earlier. So the EU and the US are our biggest trading partners. And on the AGOA website, they note that trade with SA in 2019 was 116 billion. And so being kicked out of AGOA would seemingly be quite significant for us. But you've got RMB, which has said that contrary to public opinion, they don't think that us being kicked out of AGOA would be that detrimental, because AGOA-related exports by SA are only 20.7% of total exports. But you've got the presidential website as well, which has said that our exports with other BRICS nations were at 702 billion in 2021. So looking at these numbers and looking at what RMB has said anyways, it certainly seems like being aligned with BRICS is more financially and developmentally beneficial to South Africa. Is this a conclusion that you'd reach as well, or what are your thoughts on that statement?
Look, we would need to do a variety of things in terms of dissecting that. So you'd need to check what are the supplies that formulate the AGOA-related trade. Do we have a market for those within the BRICS? Can you just redirect and divert? So there are things that you can't trade to other countries simply because they just have a lot of domestic supply of it. They net produce, and therefore they export. But also it would be almost suicidal, perhaps, with the lessons of COVID-19. In actual fact, post-COVID-19, what the world is trying to move away from is concentrated supply coming from one region. So when China shuts down, much of global trade shuts down. Because China gets hungry for certain resources that are important to power their industries and manufacturing sectors, of course, some food items and so on. But China produces a lot of goods that are transported throughout the world. So even the craze about only now looking towards BRICS and focusing on servicing that is not part of the kind of place where the world is going. The world is going towards a multipolar place. So you are going to need to have a balance of servicing relations and relationships across the divides of the power brokering that we are going towards. So, and of course, when our economy is as is, and you are earning dollars for your exports, your revenue, and then your payments gain you more, and your balance of payments probably looks healthier. So it's important to keep those things in mind. And the US is not just only the biggest economy in the world, it's also a highly populous country. So you would not probably want to stop doing business with a country that has a market for you and has a trade value in terms of the denomination of payments. What I find interesting, I mean, if you quantify 20 points, less than 30% of trade and say, yeah, that's what's under AGOA, but you then have to quantify what that means in terms of economic activity in the country. What are those sectors? Who's employed? How many people are employed? materially, what does it account for? Because sometimes I think we speak about these big things. This is the percentage of trade. Oh, sure, but that means economic activity, that means employment, that means families being able to be out of poverty, afford themselves, and so on. So what would the injury be to that entire value chain if we were kicked out? And it's not just about being kicked out, because sometimes when you are kicked out from certain agreements, such as AGOA, you're actually being isolated from your very own continent, because then somebody else must be seen as taking lead in terms of negotiating. For example, the next round of negotiations for AGOA is meant to be held in South Africa, but it keeps being postponed. It was initially meant to be now in July, then it was postponed to September, then it's been postponed to November, and some are reading it as it's an attempt to try and take it away from South Africa entirely. But some elements in DECO are still confident that we will host that. So you then become isolated and slowly become irrelevant and in certain fora and conversations. And I would think that when you've had as much global stature as South Africa has enjoyed, one, you want to keep that, but also you want to sustain your own independence, but creating a balance in terms of what are the trade-offs that you need to make in sustaining certain relationships. I do think that South Africa, though, has been used by some political elements within the US as a point of attack in its fight with Russia. So basically, the US claims that they are not part of that war, but actually on the sidelines, they are very much enjoined in that war, because they are even interested to injure certain countries. As you've seen, there have been sanctions on certain companies, but I mean, if you talk to some people, they'd say, yeah, some companies promised to pull out of Russia, but they probably pulled out one subsidiary and they left all the other companies in there, because businesses want to make money. They don't want to play politics. So they'll make a pledge, but in practical terms still remain. And some of these companies are Western companies, the same West that has said that there are sanctions against Russia. So in that sense, I think everybody is trying to play a stick and carrots game. But I think even for the US, they do know that they want healthy relationships with South Africa.
I mean, we have to ask ourselves, right, if this is really about supposed weapons being supplied to Russia, or is it really about the fact that South Africa abstained from voting against Russia, and that decision ultimately, or that action ultimately, failed to indicate neutrality by our country, that the abstinence was supposedly meant to convey?
Well, there's no evidence that as yet. There's an accusation. There's no evidence that Lady R left with weapons to Russia. Of course, there are a number of suspicious things that happened around that time. I mean, the ship docking, transponders being switched off, and so on, so that it cannot really be traced. And clearly some offloading and unloading that might have happened overnight. So the whole thing is suspicious, but you do need a process to unearth and put to rest the entire argument, because the fact that the ministers in government can speak with authority that nothing was loaded, but the president is not able to make those utterances himself, tells you already that there is a broken chain in the communication and trust relationship within government. So that does need to be put to rest. And therefore, yes, you can be punished on a suspicion, but I think it's much more than that. It's the understanding of South Africa's proximity to Russia. I mean, we did an entire joint military exercise with the Russians, and that angered a lot of people. Some of the government officials and ministers attended a party basically at the residence of the Russian ambassador to South Africa. So continuing those cultural ties. I mean, the president is with a delegation in Russia now, as we speak. And sometimes this is the world of diplomacy. Remember, you always want to, when you isolate, use multiple diplomatic instruments. Of course, sanctions being coercive diplomatic, instruments. that isolate, a particular country. So the US would love to see Russia isolated. I think even the sanctions have failed to achieve the kind of isolation that they were hoping for. And therefore, you now start targeting countries and saying that, if you don't do this, this might be the repercussion to you. That means the initial instrument, that is a direct instrument of sanction and of coercive diplomacy to the targeted party, has failed. And therefore now you must find ways to deal with the friends of the party, so that indeed that party is indeed isolated. So I think even the US itself knows that its strategy is not working, and that's indicative of how the world has changed. Not everybody shakes in their boots anymore when the US speaks. They find ways to continue doing certain things. Russia has been selling oil to Iran. So it doesn't matter if the West doesn't buy it, and Iran has been selling it off in some instances. So the world is complex, and I think the US is also stuck in its own perception of it being the most dominant player that must then direct the path of the world. Of course, Russia itself and Putin, I think, they also live in a mindset that they could recreate the Soviet Union, and that thing is past. You can never recreate the Soviet Union anymore. What you are just going to do is to cause a lot of chaos, trouble, and injury and death, but the world of yesteryear that everybody is yearning for, where they were almighty and powerful, it cannot be when there's been so many shifts in terms of independence around the world. Then the world was quite carved up and consolidated. So people had colonies, and those colonies knew they couldn't do anything without the superpower as their proxies. Now countries can actually bargain for themselves. China is not longer under British colonial rule. South Korea is not under Japanese colonial rule. It's a country that makes its own decisions.
So the whole point I'm making is that countries can't yearn for power that they've lost simply because the configuration of the global order has significantly changed. And I think this is the nervousness with BRICS because of its potential, particularly if it expands its membership in the summit that is upcoming. And I've been in some off-the-record discussions with foreign ministers from Europe whose biggest concern is what is it that brings these countries together? And because they are now suddenly not setting the agenda as European countries, they are unable to tell what brings these countries together. So that's very significant to keep in mind. And the world will continue to shift. And those who are stuck in history and in their own obsession about themselves will start being left behind by the pace of events.
Sure. So, Lukhona, how would you say that all this impacts the man on the streets or the person at home? What is that impact?
I'll tell you a story of that impact. I was conducting a focus group study in Ulundi, and I was asking people about the things that pain them about where we are. And this old lady says, mina ngiphila ngomusa wenkosi. I rely on people who donate food to me every month. But manje, when they buy me food, abasangithengeli cooking oil, so ngidla umxabiso. And she nearly broke into tears in that moment because that food without cooking oil suddenly is different because you have to boil all your food stuff. And you can imagine if you had to do that every day with your food, and you are a poor person who's reliant on this donation, so you can't say substitute this for me for cooking oil. And why that was, the timing was around June, July last year, and the Russia-Ukraine war, one of the things that it immediately affected within no time were prices of cooking oil. So that's how the person on the street is affected. And then, of course, we can go to all the other things. So, for example, if the Black Sea grain agreement is not renewed, it affects the supply of grain around the world, and so some countries who are now beginning to benefit from the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which was allowing for grain to move out of Ukraine safely into other countries, it begins to create a problem. And those countries, and then at times, particularly northern African countries, the person on the street is going to be affected by shortages of certain staple foodstuffs, and that's going to mean that they need to find either alternatives or not have those staples at all. Their diets are affected. Their food gain and nutrition and all of those things are affected. So, of course, then those who are farmers, they will see higher costs of fertilizer and such input costs, and yet the market is becoming depressed. When they sell their produce to the market, they are probably fetching less money than they did a few months ago, partly because you're also dealing with other issues that may not have to do everything with the Ukraine, Russia conflict, but other things that are happening around the world, because the world is not stopping either. Things are moving, and the world is generally dealing with inflation. And so the living cost of ordinary people become higher, while the salaries and wages of ordinary people generally remain stagnant for long periods of time before people could get increases. And this is why there have been huge threats of industrial action, whether in the public service and elsewhere, as people are being offered increases that are not necessarily in line with inflation. And of course, inflation is one thing. If you say inflation today is sitting at 5.7, 5.9% or whatever, food inflation is sitting at almost about 14%. And we know that the bulk the bulk share of salaries of underpaid people and people in poor communities, usually their money goes to food, it goes to transport, and they get left with very little else. So that's how the person on the street is affected. They're being squeezed to make trade-offs that are difficult and impossible. Of course, the other point which I was making to colleagues a few weeks ago is that the ordinary person on the street is also affected because so-called middle-class people who earn relatively well and could afford to support a relative back home with 500 rands for whether they are going to get food or 500 rands for transport to go look for work, that middle-class person is also feeling the squeeze of higher interest rates that are trying to manage inflation, the inflation itself, the higher cost of foodstuffs because of the conflict and so on. And then that middle-class person no longer is able to transfer 500 rand. Maybe they are now able only to transfer 200 rands or nothing at all. So the impact is really vast and cyclical in its nature, in the sensibilities of how the economy works, how people do cash transfers through remittances and all of that, what money people have and what it affords them and so on. And some people end up working and their salaries are on the negative, and then they decide to quit their jobs and stay at home.
So we can't not talk as well about the BRICS summit, and that was meant to be for July this year. Is it still happening in July, actually?
Yeah, in August.
In August. Oh, okay. So South Africa is a member or a signatory on the ICC. And so the expectation was very much that if Putin set foot on our shores, we would need to aid in his arrest. The DA sued the government to demand that Putin be arrested because our president had said that in an affidavit that our participation in Putin's arrest would risk a war with Russia and that putting the country at this risk would be unconstitutional. The Kremlin denies that it had explicitly told Pretoria that an attempt to arrest Putin in South Africa would be tantamount to a declaration of war. And I must just quote what they said. They said, "Nobody informed anyone about anything," said the Kremlin spokesperson. "In this world, it's absolutely clear to everyone what an attempt to encroach on the Russian leader means. Therefore, there's no need to explain anything to anyone here." Honestly, a movie. I feel like I'm in a movie right now. So what does our constitution have to say about this?
Well, the South African Constitution is quite clear. It's the supreme law of the land, and then of course flows legislative instruments. And once South Africa had been a signatory to the Rome Statute, they then developed a local legislation, which was an implementation instrument of the Rome Statute, which then means that not only did South Africa bind itself to the international agreement, it domesticated the international agreement through that legislation. And once it domesticated that legislation, it can't, self-recuse until it repeals that legislation. On the other hand, I think our government was set into a panic, particularly because they were not in charge of the situation, and overly opened space for people to accuse the government of not taking a firm stance, because the government at some point was looking for a way out. Could they use diplomatic immunity? Could they then repeal? That was the discussion within the ANC's National Executive Committee. Or should they send envoys to Putin? And of course, the only thing that they really had at their disposal as an instrument was to use diplomatic channels and prevail on Putin not to come here. The most cowardly thing to do would have been to relocate the summit from South Africa to a different country. But of course, then this creates tensions because these things work on a rotation basis. Therefore, wherever South Africa would have relocated the BRICS summit, one, it definitely could not be outside of the BRICS partners' territory, and therefore that would mean there's a BRICS partner who's had a second bite at the cherry out of sequence with others. But it also then creates another problem for South Africa, whether they would be seen as being evading responsibility and therefore donating a part of their sovereignty in a way to accommodate Putin. So you then want to deal with those narratives and those perceptions because they could weaken your standing. And if Putin is so much your friend, then why can't you prevail on him not to come? And I think that's what has won the day. But the whole thing was clumsily handled. There were some alarmist remarks that were made. I don't think that anyone would allow a situation that brings about some war between Russia and Ukraine. Those were Russia and South Africa, those were alarmist remarks because South Africa had not exhausted its diplomatic channels. In any case, Putin couldn't be defiant of South Africa's calls because South Africa is in charge of its own airspace and he can fly to the country without the particular clearances and all of these other things. So there were so many channels available to South Africa to handle this thing properly, and again indicative of a government that is slow to act, takes too much time, and therefore by the time it acts, different people have developed doubt on its capacity and capability to lead itself.
I mean, yeah, my view on this is, I mean, it's definitely a tricky one. I don't know, it certainly feels like we're just caught in the middle of a long-spanning power struggle between the West and the East here.
No, absolutely, and I think many countries are going to be caught up in that. It's inevitable, but there will be a battle if countries are rigid in terms of saying how do they, in a fair way, exist within the new global order. Because the new global order is upon us. It's not a theoretical thing. It's happening. So how do countries position themselves? I think the best thing is to think of ways of coexisting. And if that means that there must be an opening up of a conversation within the United Nations about a rearrangement of the global order, just like there was when the world was changing within the League of Nations, and then an understanding that the United Nations itself needed to transform and reconfigure. Because in order for there to be regional cooperation and peace and stability in the world, you do need a sense of a consensus on how to coexist, and it has to be negotiated. And the longer it takes for this to be done, the more we will see countries, taking up initiative on their own to secure their own interests, and that's what's going to create chaos.
Agreed. Lastly, to end us off, Lukhona, why does all this matter? And I mean, you've touched on how this impacts the man on the street earlier on in our conversation. But what would you say is any additional reason why this should matter to us and why this does matter to us as the listeners today?
Well, this does matter to us. It matters to us because we have to make choices in terms of who are our leaders. So particularly for South Africans, as they go to elections, they've got to probably assess which political party or parties have a fair understanding of the world as it is, and have a clear articulation of South Africa's interest in the changing world. So obviously that's why it matters. So we have to make sober political choices as citizens about where we are in the world and where we are going in the world. So that's very important. But it matters to also get a sense of who are the fair players and where could the threats come from and so on. But it matters for us to make maybe other strategic choices. I mean, Zimbabwe, for example, says they need to grow more wheat on their own. So where do you focus industry that will give you food security as a country? So how do you invest money in those agricultural sectors? What trade-offs do you make? Where do you rely less on imports so that if the world changes, and generally when the world is going through a transition, you tend to find that there are some parts of the world that implement what we call protectionist policies in their trade, and therefore make it harder for you to sell certain things to them. So these are really important calculations that need to be made. Where are you most likely to get global funding? How will the future of developmental aid change going forward? And of course, a changing world with potential changing migration patterns in the next 20 years because of climate change and global warming, where some countries will really become difficult for people to live, either because of almost permanent flooding or permanent drought, and therefore people will migrate naturally to search for greener pastures. And what does that mean? What kind of laws do you put in place? How do you secure your borders, particularly for a country like us that has already had an influx of people migrating either because of political reasons or socio-economic reasons, whether it's from Zimbabwe, the DRC, Nigeria, and so on. So these are not just conversations that are high up there and theoretical. These are conversations with material implications.
Thank you so much for spending time with us today, Lukhona. We really look forward to having some future conversations with you. This has been really, really insightful.
No, thank you very much for inviting me to this podcast, and I really, really wish you absolutely the best on this journey.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Have a good one.
What a fascinating conversation we had. This conversation and preparing for it really stretched me. Politics is not something I've had a deep understanding of in the past, and largely due to lack of interest, to be honest. Looking back, I also had some political views I think now were quite questionable, or rather underdeveloped. In fact, I checked my Facebook memories every day for a year to make sure there weren't remnants of my ignorance on there, which I'd missed or forgotten about. Super cringe fest. Look, it's still not really a strong area of mine, but it matters a lot more than it used to. As Christians, I don't believe we can simply bury our noses in our Bibles and shut off what happens outside of that space, because what happens outside of that Bible reading space in politics impacts us in a very real and direct way. Also, the Bible doesn't shy away from politics either. We have prominent people in the Bible who served in government positions: Joseph, Esther, Daniel, to name just a few. Regardless of their circumstances, they all stewarded the blessings and opportunities entrusted to them, as we all should do. Paul pleads in 1 Timothy 2 verse 1-2. Therefore, I exhort first of all that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings, and all who are in authority, but we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and reverence. When last did we pray for our president? When last did we speak out against injustice? A well-functioning government ensures that justice and human good prevails. And so it is clear that engagement in this area is important, whichever way each of us are called to, which for some may be more involvement, and for others just as simple as voting and essentially stewarding that responsibility. But in order to do that, we do need to be informed, right? In order to make informed decisions. And that is ultimately what I hope this podcast helped you with in the discussion we've had now and the discussions we will have in the future. Regardless of what we believe politically, we do need to remember that at the end of the day, God is the ultimate authority above all men and above all organizations or governments. To close us off, I do want to end with a Bible verse. Matthew 24 verse 3-14 says, "The signs of the times and the end of the age. Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And Jesus answered and said to them, Take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended, will betray one another, and will hate one another. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. And because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations. And then the end will come. Friends, nothing happening right now should take us by surprise. Should we pray about it? Yes. Should we remain hopeful? Yes. But we should always know that our hope transcends beyond times of peace or times of war. Our hope is Jesus. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you tune in next time. If you've enjoyed this episode, please like and follow this podcast or leave us a comment. We'd love to hear from you. This is me saying goodbye and reminding you of your ultimate calling in this moment, this day, and this week, to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever.